And let me just say, once again, it's a privilege to welcome Mrs. Anda Zahiu. She's a PhD student in the Research Center in Applied Ethics at the University of Bucharest. And her talk is titled A Lockean Case for Digital Labor. Anda, please take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrei. Okay, so first of all, disclaimer, this is work in progress. So this is going to be the first time I'm presenting this work. Please feel not only free, but please contribute with your suggestions, observations, questions. I hope that you're going to mix your intellectual labor with my presentation. And who knows, maybe you're going to be entitled to the fruits of the labor after today. The second disclaimer is that this is not only going to be a presentation about digital labor, but I overreached a bit. It's going to be a presentation about how we are to understand the Lockean argument for private ownership and what does it have to do with digital labor and with our entitlements, potential entitlements to our personal data. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the part that is going to be a bit boring when I describe the situation and why I believe that it is important to discuss about the regime of ownership over our personal data. This reason is quite clear, I believe, that the digital population increases at a very alarming rate. People are extremely connected to devices, to certain platforms. So we contribute a lot of data to a business model that relies on this data that is infused in algorithms. So we spend a lot of time online, 40% of our waking lives, according to the Institute for Internet Research. So as this happens, we see that this business model takes off because companies, they collect, they analyze, they utilize our data to create insights, sometimes to improve algorithms, to refine their services. This is the case of reCAPTCHA or Google Translate. Every time you use these services, you are basically fine-tuning a machine learning algorithm. The situation is quite clear. We know why the discussion about data ownership became more and more important. So the value generation through big data, what happens in this business model is that it can occur among multiple parties, as data can also be sold to other companies, aggregators, or researchers. But none of the profits return to the original owners of the information, that is the user. This is a prediction done in 2013 in an article by Trotman and Zhang. They predict that by 2045, everyone is going to be online. We have to live and see if the prediction is going to become true. But what is certain is that the trend is definitely ascending. So people go online, people use more and more platforms and social media or internet services by and large. And this is not the only thing that we use. We also use the Internet of Things. So we live in a world in which we leave a lot of digital traces. Some of them can be traced back to us, so they are associated with a natural person. This is the official definition of personal data, what can be traced back to us as users. But we also can talk about other types of digital footprints that are not personal in this sense, so they cannot be traced back to a particular user. So we engage in various activities. Some of them are activities of self-tracking when you use devices that measure, I don't know, how many steps you did today, how well you slept last night, and so on and so forth. So this is the world of digital traces in which we live at the moment. And this prompted my philosophical reflection. What happens with our data? What type of entitlements should users have to their own data? Now, there's a very interesting proposal in the literature. It has been advanced a few years ago by Francis Cheneval, who believes that there are two theoretical frameworks that can justify granting property rights for personal data to individuals. One of them would be Rawls's justice as fairness, and the second one would be a Lockean theory of, or more generally speaking, personhood type theories. And Cheneval believed that this process of justifying a regime of private property would be quite straightforward, following Locke's argument in favor of labor mixing arrangements. Because we have a data value chain, we contribute the raw material, and afterwards, the platform usually does the collection, the publication, the aggregation, leading to the final impact. So it is both us who provide materials, who provide a resource, and the platform that is processing this data and enriching it with value once this data becomes a part of big data, and it can be used for targeting purposes or for analytics and so on and so forth. Now, it's very important to say that when we refer to property, we do not refer to one thing, we refer to a bundle of rights. Some of these rights are the right to control, the right to compensate, the right to coerce or sanction, the right to transfer, and immunity to non-consensual losses. These are the rights that Valentine or Tsuka, for example, talk about, but you're going to see that this is the consensus on what property rights consist in. So in our case, an entitlement, like a prima facie entitlement, would be to have a regime of private property that splits these rights between the owners and the platform. So it cannot be just the owners of data that are justified in controlling it, but also the platform that provides value to this said resource. Okay, and now the philosophical part begins, and I hope that this is going to be like the interesting part of the presentation. When we advance a Lockean argument in favor of self-data ownership, we can follow two routes, or at least this is the consensus in the literature. I'm going to say that this is not the case, that these routes can never be separated if we are to interpret Locke as he probably intended his argument to function. So some people say that we can use personhood type justification and say that personal information has an informational nature by default, like Floridi maintains. So it is enough to use the self-ownership premise, that because individuals have control over their own persons, they have control over everything that is an emanation of their own personhood, they should be entitled to this would justify a claim right over personal data. The problem with this account, of course, there are many problems with this account, but the problem is that it is quite difficult to justify a partial claim right. To say that I'm going to split this right with the platform, because the platform is also entitled. So you use an additional argument, an additional step, that is the labor mixing argument. Okay, so let's see how the argument unfolds. This is a reconstruction that is proposed by Months in her article from 2022, a reconstruction of Locke's argument. So the premise one would be, if persons are the original owners of their respective personhoods, bodies, and minds, then mixing their labor with something unknown generates property rights over the thing in question, provided that a certain proviso is satisfied. That is the condition of non-worsening. The second premise is that persons are the original owners of their respective personhoods, bodies, and minds. So the conclusion that follows from this is that mixing a person's labor with something unknown generates property rights over the thing in question, provided that a certain proviso is satisfied. So here we have both premises at play. We have the labor mixing argument as well as the self-ownership thesis. Okay, let's see what the problem with this reconstruction would be. Now, various researchers advanced this argument in the literature, saying that following a labor mixing argument to justify intellectual property rights, this was a discussion in the intellectual property rights debate, is extremely counterintuitive and has some absurd implications. And in the case of digital labor, that this is not one of the instances of labor. So this is what I'm going to try to rebut today, to say that the route is counterintuitive and has absurd implications only because it is badly misconstrued. And secondly, that this is in fact one instance of labor, right? Digital labor, when you mix your anything, your information with the platform, when you produce content on Facebook, on Instagram, when you contribute with something to reCAPTCHA algorithms, for example. So I argue that these objections are the result of partial reconstructions of Locke's argument in favor of private ownership, which became the orthodox reading of Locke due to famous philosophers such as Tolley, Nozick, McPherson, Ashcraft, Waldron, or G. Cohen. You'll notice that they're very different. All these philosophers are extremely different in their assumptions, in their political positions. What they have in common nonetheless is that they reconstruct Locke's argument extremely uncharitable. And I'm going to try and show that this is the case. Okay, so you remember the premises, right? The Lockean labor mixing argument, the self-ownership thesis. Let's see what the counterintuitive example, what the counterintuitive implication of applying them would be. So we have the restaurant case. It was proposed by Mainz in her article 2020. And she asked us to imagine that Smith is a very famous actor. He's having dinner with his friend Jones at a restaurant. Jones happens to be a freelance journalist, and unbeknownst to Smith, Jones is covering Smith's everyday life. Jones is secretly transcribing the entire conversation on his tablet. Smith reveals to Jones the fact that Smith has terminal cancer. The day after, Jones sells the transcript to the tabloid press. Okay, this is the case. Applying the two premises, right, that we've seen, this is what we're going to get. If we apply the first premise, that is the labor mixing argument, we're going to see that there can be instances in which the labor mixing argument grants at least a partial claim to ownership to some other people than the original owner, whilst the original owner cannot be said to have any claim to it. That appears to be the case in the restaurant example. Smith tells Jones something private about himself, that he has terminal cancer. Jones records the conversation, sells it to the tabloid press. It would appear that Smith has no entitlement whatsoever to a piece of information that used to belong to him originally. Now, if we are to apply the second premise, we obtain that we see that Smith is taken to be necessarily the holder of property rights over the information he is sharing with Jones. So if Smith owns the data only in virtue of it being a constituting part of his identity, then the mix of labor with the personal information has no status changing quality over this claim. The same thing can be said about Jones's claim over the data. Therefore, if the self-ownership principles can rightfully be extended to personal data, then mixing labor can no longer account for acquiring a partial claim to an external object. So what we are left with is an ad hoc support in favor of the self-ownership thesis as a non-derivative moral principle. So we have to accept at face value that individuals are the original owners of their personhood and everything that can emanate from that. And this would be or should be enough in order to grant them a claim of ownership, for them to stake a claim at ownership. But then you cannot account for cases in which someone else appears to have some sort of entitlement over the same object. So it appears to be a dilemma. Let's see if it is indeed a dilemma, or if this problem has its source in the way in which law is currently understood in contemporary philosophy. Okay, let's see how Jeremy Waldron reconstructs Locke labor mixing argument in one of his well-known articles from 1983, Two Worries About Mixing One's Labor. So Waldron does a very, let's say, risky move in that he treats this argument, this labor mixing argument, as being a standalone argument. And he reconstructs it as follows. So a person who labors on an object mixes his labor with that object, but that person owns the labor which he mixes with the object. So the object which has been labored on contains something which the laborer owns. To take the object out of the laborer's control without his consent will violate the entitlement mentioned in 2 and 3. Therefore, no one may take the object out of the laborer's control without his consent. But this amounts to an entitlement in the labor over the object. Thus, a person who has labored on an object is entitled to that object. Now, Waldron believes that this argument, the labor mixing argument, has some absurd implications. And his example, he has a very funny example in this paper, the sandwich case, or the sandwich example. And he asked us to imagine that a random individual makes for himself or herself a sandwich, sees some concrete that hasn't yet been hardened, and decides to drop the sandwich in this pool of concrete that doesn't appear to belong to someone, right? So it's just lying there. Someone just poured concrete on the road, but it doesn't appear to be owned by someone. So Waldron says, okay, so I'm mixing my labor, or an object of my labor, that is the sandwich, with the concrete. So now I should be entitled to owning that concrete, right? I can stake a claim right to that piece of concrete that hardens around my sandwich, because I cannot really take back my sandwich. Once I threw the sandwich in the concrete, it is lost for good. So we see that the way in which the argument is reconstructed leads to an absurd implication. In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick has a similar example with the tomato juice. Imagine that I make tomato juice and then decide to pour it into the ocean. It is radioactive, so that I can check how far my tomato juice has contaminated the ocean, and what is the piece of ocean that I'm going to be entitled to. So now these appear to be some very strong objections to the labor mixing argument. But I argue that this is not the case. And this is how I propose that we reconstruct Locke's argument, the whole argument, not just the labor mixing argument. Because if we treat the labor mixing argument as standing on its own, then we're going to miss out on a lot of things that are extremely important in Locke's theory of private property. For example, his natural law theory, the value theory of work, and so on and so forth. So let's see how the argument can be reconstructed. So first of all, we assume, as Locke does, that the fundamental duty, moral duty of individuals as beings of reason is that of preserving themselves and mankind. So this is what the natural law dictates to individuals. This is the moral duty, the supreme or fundamental moral duty that individuals have. The second premise would be that external resources have an unproductive default, bar the human labor that gives them useful direction. This is something that appears explicitly in the 5th chapter of the second treaty on government. The third premise is that persons are the original and sole owners of their respective personhood. That would be the self-ownership principle. The fourth premise is that labor is the result of persons exercising physical and intellectual effort on external object, thus mixing something that belongs to them to an unknown external object. This is known in the literature as the asymmetry thesis. The fifth premise is that from 3 and 4, the third and the fourth premise allow for individuals to stake a claim of ownership to external resources. And here we have the labor mixing argument. The sixth premise is that from 1 and 2 provide a moral basis of private ownership, that is the natural law and what we can observe about resources lying around with no productive use whatsoever. And the final premise is that 1 and 4 institute a moral limit to appropriation, that is the Lockean proviso. So in conclusion, persons are entitled to the fruits of their labor, right, from 3, 4, and 5, when 6 and 7 are satisfied. In other words, when the moral basis of private property and when the moral limit of appropriation are satisfied. Okay, let's see what we have achieved with this reconstruction. We go back to the restaurant case, and the question that comes to mind is a question that unfortunately has only been asked up to this point by legal scholars. Not many philosophers ask themselves this question: what type of speech can attract copyright? And the answer to this dilemma, I think, that resides in this in these three observations. The first one pertains to the ontology of information. So data, by default, is a non-rivalrous good and a non-tangible good. So it is something that I cannot lose. Even if I share with Jones the fact that this information that I've been diagnosed with terminal cancer, I'm not losing this information. I cannot be excluded from owning this information. And this is in virtue of the ontology of information. Now, the second observation is that I have private ownership includes the right to control an object. And this is very important. We have to keep this in mind because this has a very important implication. And self-ownership, right, would imply that we have the right to retain control over whatever information is associated with the natural person by the said person. So that is not to say that Jones doesn't have, maybe he has an entitlement. But for now, it is enough to say that Smith will not lose ownership over the data in the moment in which he makes that information public. So Jones does not acquire ownership of the information, but possession, right? He'll be in the possession of this piece of information, which refers to the fact of coming to know the information, right? I cannot, once he found out, I cannot exclude him from knowing the information. What I can do is stop him from using that information, that is fixing the information into a tangible into a tangible form. So because self-ownership grants individuals the ontological protection, right? This is the purpose, if you like, of self-ownership arguments. And this is what Sobel, for example, argues. And it grants us the ontological protection against things like privacy infringement, mistreatment, worsening, and so on and so forth. So James cannot exert private ownership over the information X without Smith's consent. So if we are to reconstruct Locke, as I did earlier, what the implication of this is that Jones can acquire a partial claim to ownership over the fixed information. That is the article that he writes, or I don't know, the speech that he uploads on YouTube. But at the end of the day, it will be Smith who has the right to control that piece of information. So if Smith says, right, this is going to worsen my life, you're doing me a disservice by publishing this piece of information, then control should reside, the ability to control should reside with Smith in virtue of him having private ownership over that piece of information. So the question is, okay, so is Jones entitled to anything at all? To answer like a philosopher, the answer is it depends. It depends on how Jones is going to do the fixation, right? Because Locke believed that it is not just skill and labor that ultimately justify claim right, but the ability of the laborer to discern what goods are worthy of their directed effort, what actions violate the proviso, and when actions are not in tune with the demands of natural law. So I cannot stake a claim right to anything just in virtue of me laboring on a particular object, on a particular external object. And this is how Nozick's example with the tomato juice spilled in the ocean can be rebutted. Now we have a second consideration, right? Respecting the proviso. Claims to ownership must always respect the boundaries of worsening. So the act of appropriation is essentially relational. It depends on what happens to other people. In the case of tangible goods, the proviso is almost always satisfied by the creation of prosperity, right? This is the argument that is put forward by David Schmidt, for example, who says that the proviso should never be interpreted literally, right? Because it is obvious that resources are like a pie, and once you take a piece out of the pie, you're going to have less pieces of the pie to share with others. So the proviso is always satisfied because by appropriation, we generate prosperity. So at best, Jones can stake a partial claim to ownership in virtue of the labor he undertook, but Smith's right to control will always override. And this would be, it would be the same case when we discuss about our personal data, right? Companies can acquire a claim right to a part of these profits that are generated by the data or to our data directly. But at the end of the day, following the Lockean route, we must concede that the original owners of the data should always retain the right to control what happens to their data. Because that would be the natural implication of the argument. Now, the second question is, can we really talk about labor in this particular instance? Because it seems like what we do on social media, for example, can be called at best accidental labor, because we don't have an intention to work. We don't put a lot of effort into it. We do it for entertainment. And this idea, I believe that is also something that we inherited, if you like, from philosophers such as Nozick and Cohen, at least when it comes to how we should interpret John Locke. Because they believe that Locke talked about labor as an equivalent with the sweat of the brow, right? That work should be something, or labor should be something that requires a lot of effort. And a lot of people think about labor in this way, as a kind of drudgery or hard work. In Cohen's words, actual sweating toil. But for Locke, this is not at all the case, because what matters when we talk about labor is not how we carry it out, if it's effortless or if it requires a lot of effort. What is important is that it makes a resource, right? It is what turns a resource into a resource, and it gives it value, not just market value, but value in a more robust sense. By giving materials the direction they have to have if they are to satisfy our needs, right? Remember, the fact that they satisfy our needs, this is what justifies the institution of private property. This is the moral foundation of private property. So for Locke, labor would be a directive principle. Let's see how, let's see an example from the second treaty of government. Consider his example of picking an apple from a tree. Here, a person takes a raw material, right, an apple on a tree, and makes it a product that meets her needs simply by picking it and making it available for consumption. That is now useful in the right way. This is the simplest case of creating a resource, turning something that might meet a need into something that actually does, right? Just by changing its location, just by picking up the apple from the tree. So this is what Russell means by directive principle. The apple has the potential of being useful for our lives in satisfying our needs, but until the moment in which we mix our labor with this resource, it is just that, right? Potential. When we mix our labor with the resource, we actually create it as a resource. So labor would be direction, not exertion. Okay, sorry. I'll try to speed up through the presentation. Okay, so what would be digital labor? It would be something different than how researchers use today digital labor. That is the same thing with platform labor. That kind of labor that is mediated, that mediates service work, right? This term is used to refer to things like Uber, Glovo, and so on and so forth, everything that pertains to the sharing economy. But in our case, what I'm referring to is that the active participation of users to creation, distribution, and selection of content on the internet, active participation in feedback loops, and self-tracking practices. So what we have is a concept that has the following traits. It is a productive activity, right? Because it produces data that can be captured in commodity form. It is dependent on the digital infrastructure. This is the reason why we can only stake a partial claim right to it. It says something about the creator. It belongs to us in virtue of our self-ownership. And it has a performative character sometimes. Some of these activities, when we generate content, sometimes they have this trait, but of course, not always. Okay, so the question is, we have an ownership claim to what? To the platform that I mix my labor with? Probably not, because I just rejected, right, this line of reasoning that started with Robert Nozick. So we would have probably a moral entitlement that the benefits stemming from the economic activity that use the digital citizen's personal data as a resource, when the following conditions are met, or in the worst case scenario, we would have a complete claim, right, to control the data. I don't know how this thing would look practically. This is why I believe that it's a lot easier to say that we have a moral entitlement to economical benefits that stem from this activity. So to the positive externalities that we generate by mixing our labor with the platform, because this could, I don't know, take the form of a universal basic income that is financed through a tax levied on such companies. So it would be a lot easier to internalize these external benefits if we frame this moral entitlement as such. But it would go both ways. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I hope that it was an engaging presentation.
All right, thanks so much, Anda, and I'm sure everyone's joining me for a round of applause. And we already have a first question from Ovidio. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anda.